Today we're going to start talking about climate change. For our climate change lecture, I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail, not all the detail, but I'm going to touch on a lot of the evidences for climate change. The reason why I'm going into so much depth on this issue is because it's turned into a controversial issue where some people have decided that climate change is just not a thing. Scientifically, it is very, very much a thing. There's lots and lots of evidence that our climate is changing. Now, one of the arguments against climate change is the fact that this is a natural process that is occurring, and there's some partial truth to that. It is normal for our planet's climate to change over time. But what is true about that statement, which is not discussed when they make these blanket statements that it's just natural, is that this process of our climate changing over time normally takes hundreds of thousands of years. And what we're seeing instead is this rapid change in our climate that's occurring over decades instead, just like tens of years. And so during just your short lifetimes, there's been a drastic change in what's going on in our ecosystem, and people are seeing those effects very, very quickly. And the problem with that is it does not give animals, including humans and plants, time to adapt to the changing environment. So what we're going to see is these huge mass extinctions or migrations in organisms. And we've already started seeing the effects of that. So there's no doubt that climate change is occurring, and there's very little doubt that humans are impacting this by our use of fossil fuels. So let's jump in and look at some of these evidences, and this is going to be a longer lecture, so I'm going to split it up into two parts for you guys. So here we go. What exactly is going on? So we've talked already about the layers of the atmosphere, and that the atmosphere we particularly live in is the troposphere. So just as a reminder, the atmosphere is all the air surrounding the surface of the Earth, and it's made out of a variety of gases, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% other, okay? We all have to have an atmosphere in order to survive, to have the gases that we need to breathe, or to do photosynthesis for plants, and also to keep our Earth warm, okay? So these gases, some of them act like a blanket, trapping heat in from the sun, and these are called greenhouse gases. So some greenhouse gases in our atmosphere are necessary for life on this planet to exist. But what we're experiencing now is too much of a good thing. We have too many greenhouse gases where we're trapping more heat, and it's affecting our weather systems. So the natural greenhouse effect is a good thing, but the unnatural effect we're experiencing now is not. So how exactly does this work? So you can think about it like your car on a hot day. On a nice, it doesn't even have to be hot actually, just a sunny day. On a sunny day when your car and your windows are up and you park it in a sunny spot, the light comes in. When the light comes in through your windshield, right, the waves are at basically a lot of energy. So you got these short wavelengths coming in with a lot of energy. When it hits the upholstery on the inside of your car, those wavelengths lose some of their energy, and so they end up bouncing around inside the car instead of exiting back out through the windshield. And so over time, your car heats up. So when you open your door, you get this blast of heat in your car from that nice sunny day. Well, the Earth is kind of the same way. The wavelengths of light coming in from the sun from outer space go through our atmosphere and hit the surface of the Earth. Normally, when it hits the surface of the Earth, some of those bounce back out into space. And some of those get trapped on our planet, warming our Earth. As we increase the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, less and less of that energy that's bouncing off the surface of the Earth can escape back out into space, and it gets trapped here on our planet, warming our planet overall. This does not mean that it's hot all the time everywhere, because weather still exists on our planet. What it does mean is that the overall temperature increases, warming our oceans, which makes more extreme weather events because you're adding energy to the system. And that's what we're experiencing. More extreme droughts, more extreme floods, more extreme hurricanes. Those are the things that are occurring. Not that the whole world gets warm. That's not how our planet works. Okay? So here for your notes is what's happening on Earth. The solar energy hits the Earth's atmosphere, like I just said. Some of it is bounced back out into space, but most of it passed through and warms the surface of our Earth, which keeps us able to live on our planet. Excess heat is radiated back out to the environment into long wave infrared radiation. So long wave is less energy. Short wave is high energy. Some of the gases on our atmosphere act like glass in the car windows that we talked about, and they either block or absorb some of that energy. As a result, we get warmer. So over time, what we're looking at is there is an increase in temperature of average temperature. However, if you look at the scale of the temperature, it's not really huge amounts that we're seeing the difference of. We're just talking about a degree or two. But just that degree or two can actually make quite a bit of difference in our weather systems. So what are these gases in our atmosphere that are trapping all this heat? Well, again, we talked previously that our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen and oxygen. But these are not the ones that are the problem. It's the other 1% that is left. And in these 1%, which is a very small amount of our atmosphere, and remember our atmosphere is like the skin on an apple when we're talking about our planet. So with this 1%, these are carbon dioxide, which we know as humans we produce quite a bit of, methane, which is also produced by our farming practices from livestock, nitrous oxides from our factories, ozone from our vehicles, water vapor that we make a variety of ways, and halocarbons, all right, which are the smallest percentage. So all of these things, because it's such a small amount of our atmosphere, that you can say, oh, but we're so small, how could we? Well, one, remember there's over 7.8 billion humans on the planet, and all of us are producing some greenhouse gases, some more than others. And then you take into account that this is only 1% of the atmosphere, and so to make a difference in 1% of the atmosphere is not that mind-boggling at all, is it? So human activity is increased the amount of these gases, for sure. All right, and we have the data to support that, and I will show you that later. Like right now. So here we are in this graph, and this is only till the mid-1990s, this particular graph, but you can see the overall trends. That while some of our air pollution, like sulfates, have gone down, things like ozone and greenhouse gases in particular have really increased. And when you put this in with our temperature change, you can follow the pattern, all right, the trend that is there. So again, we're comparing the natural greenhouse effect to the one that we have kind of done. So in the natural greenhouse effect, we have heat, then some of it gets trapped, and then some of it goes back out into space. And this is all the heat that came from the sun originally. So quite a lot is trapped, and the Earth is warm enough for life. Now, with our enhanced greenhouse effect, which is done by human interference, some of this heat radiates out, but the atmosphere has more greenhouse gases. So it's a little thicker, and these are the gases that trap energy. And so more of it gets trapped and less of it is going out. And so overall, more heat is trapped, causing our Earth as a whole to start warming. But again, weather still exists, so it's not like it's a uniform thing. So is the climate changing? Well, yeah, temperatures are increasing, our sea levels are rising, the ocean is becoming more acidic, which is really bad news, and climate change is reflected in our water cycle with our extreme weather events that I mentioned. So all of these things are things we are definitely witnessing right now in real time. So ecological impacts. Living things are going to be impacted by this in our ecosystem. So temperature will affect them, rainfall for sure, pH, salinity, how salty or not salty the water is, and also distribution of species based on temperature again. So let's talk about some examples of these. All right, so as a result of climate change, species are experiencing all these stressors. Their ranges are changing. The time of their biological activity, like mating seasons, are being altered. Growth rates, especially with plants, are being altered. So farmers are starting to have hard times with their crops, and they're having to readjust when they plant. right? The relative abundance of species are affected. Some species we're getting more of and some we're getting less. Our cycles are being messed up. And of course, we're going to have these big ecological disturbances of wildfires and hurricanes. So let's talk more in detail about ranges right now. So species are relocating based on temperature. And one of the things we're seeing is if we look in the United States, that the warmer temperatures are creeping up. So if you look in Virginia in particular, we don't see a huge difference in our state, but one state down in North Carolina, things are getting a lot warmer. And so what we're seeing is some of these exotic species that we normally associate with Florida starting to creep up into Georgia, and some of the species associated with Georgia are starting to creep up into North Carolina, and then eventually they can make it up into Virginia. So with temperature comes this shift. So some organisms can handle these changes in temperature, that they're adapted to cold environments. And so either these species can't move fast enough, especially plants, because they can't move basically at all. They just move with the sun, but they can't get up and walk away. But also organisms that are specialists like polar bears. As this gets warmer here, you see the ice melting in these polar areas, and these guys lose their food source and places to hunt. What about timing of biological activity? So some seasonal biological activities are happening significantly earlier than they used to just a couple decades ago, and we have the data that supports this. Our trees are blooming earlier in the year. Birds are migrating earlier, and butterflies are emerging earlier as well. So we have all this data showing these shifts in these seasons. So changes in timing differ from species to species, so their interactions with each other can be altered as well, which can cause some species populations to get too large and the other ones to get too small, or the species don't have a food source when they normally would, like the European pied flycatcher. So when the chicks are born, normally they're born at the same time as the caterpillars that they eat. But with these shifting of the seasons in which they reproduce, they're not necessarily overlapping anymore, and this can cause a lot of extinctions. So how does this impact the Pacific coastline over there on the West Coast? Our wine industry is becoming impacted by climate change. So the vineyards and the farms, their growing seasons are altering, all right? And then the warming is making it harder and harder for them to not only project what's going to happen, but also to just like grow their crops in period. In Alaska and the Arctic, I mentioned the thing about the polar bears. So we're having problems with ice-dependent animals. So our ice is shrinking, which is contributing to sea level rises. Walruses and polar bears and all these guys that look for these platforms of ice to nurse and rest after swimming no longer have those. And so their numbers are greatly decreasing. And polar bears, it's very likely, many scientists agree, that polar bears will go extinct during your lifetime in the wild. Another thing that happens with these is this thing called a feedback loop, that as the ice melts, it actually causes it to melt faster. All right, it's a positive feedback. So ice usually covers things like rock, and ice is white and reflects light and helps it stay cool. Once it starts to melt, there's darker surfaces underneath, either ocean water or rock or vegetation, and that absorbs more light and actually causes it to melt faster underneath. And so one of the things that has puzzled scientists is the sheets of ice for a while there looked like they were actually pretty steady, even though we knew the temperatures were changing. And what it was is there was the big pockets of thawed ice turned into water underneath a thinner layer of ice, and it was fooling them into thinking the ice was there, but actually the ice was incredibly thin compared to what it should be. The other bad thing is when permafrost actually starts to thaw out, which is permanently frozen land, that further releases more carbon dioxide and methane, which could increase our greenhouse gases and make more of a problem. In the Western Mountains, what we're seeing is wildfires. All right, lots of wildfires are occurring, problems with drought that are associated with the wildfires, and insects, like huge swarms of insects that never happened before. So of course with droughts, you're going to have more likely have fire. So this does not necessarily have to do with the management of the forests, though that can play a role in this with the buildup of dead fuels from the trees, but more importantly has to do with the lack of water, and so things get dry. And so what we're seeing is our wildfire seasons becoming longer and more frequent and more nasty. All right, and so of course this is going to cause a big effect on those ecosystems. We've also seen some changes in trout. So trout's a food source for a lot of organisms, not just humans, but the earlier springs and warmer summers are reducing the stream flows as the mountain snow melts, or there's less mountain snow to begin with. So it's either melting earlier. And so it's not matching up to when the trout are coming back. And the streams are so warm that it's actually killing them off before they can get upstream to reproduce. And so we're seeing drops in trout numbers due to this. Even the deserts are being affected. So in the deserts, we see more wildfires because things are incredibly dry, and deserts are already dry to begin with. But usually they're considered areas that are not super flammable because of the lack of vegetation. But now we have these invasive species that couldn't normally survive in that ecosystem. They're surviving now, these grasses that are coming in, and they're very flammable. So these grasses basically make it so wildfires can occur there. All right, and then they readapt very quickly, and then they're going to take over the habitat from the plants that would normally be there, like the cacti. In the central U.S., it's going to affect our ability to grow food. All right, it's difficult to figure out what exactly is happening with our food because our technology as far as farming is changing so rapidly that it's compensating for some of these effects, but we're definitely experiencing droughts in these areas and having to tap into our aquifers more often, which we've talked about in the past. There are some good side effects of climate change as far as plant growth, is that with more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, plants actually like that and helps them to grow faster. Unfortunately, the plants that we're growing do not help at all to remove the carbon dioxide because when we cut them down, that carbon dioxide is released back up into the atmosphere. So we're not sure the full effect of that, but it's definitely altering some things like growing seasons and the ability to get water. So with that water, there's these other temporary little lakes that typically occurred called prairie potholes. And these are used by migratory birds as they go back home or fly away, depending on the season, to rest and feed and mate. Well, these little waterways are drying up. And so without them, between irrigation and pollution on top of that, these birds don't have a place to mate or feed. And so it's making migration very, very hard on them. And bird numbers are dropping as well. In the southeast, our area, we're worried about sea level rise. So as all that ice melts, the water comes up and it changes our shoreline. And that's going to make it really hard for organisms to adapt as places that are normally not underwater are underwater. And they might be nesting grounds for birds like we're seeing over in Virginia Beach. All right, and so landward movement of mangroves and marshes, they can also impact human development, and we can have massive amounts of erosion as well. Our coral reefs, even out in the ocean, are being affected. So as climate change is doing a lot of things to our poor coral reefs, changing the temperature alone can affect them, but also heat stress causes something called coral bleaching, and you can see that down here where the coral turns white. Coral is covered by little tiny living organisms called polyps, and when they die, the white part underneath is actually just the calcium that they secrete. So there's nothing living on them when they're white, and when they have color on them, that's the living organism. So they're leaving what's not really truly bones, but it's just calcium. Our oceans are also becoming more acidic, so it's called ocean acidification. This occurs because carbon dioxide, when it is put into water, makes an acid. That's why your soda is so acid, because we pump carbon dioxide in there, and that's why you can clean rust off your bumper with Coca-Cola. So this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere gets absorbed by the ocean and changes the pH of the ocean, which can affect many, many, many organisms. All right, impacts in the southeast again, we get some northward movement of tropical species that normally would not. So we have some birds and butterflies coming up, which might not sound so bad, but also reptiles are starting to move north. Our fisheries are being impacted in the northeast. So fish are very temperature dependent. So cod, they like the cold water. Lobsters are affected by oxygen levels because as water gets warmer, it doesn't hold as much oxygen. And so species can actually suffocate in there. And then oysters are getting parasites. The parasites like the warm water and they're reproducing more. And these are all things that we're also economically dependent on. So what exactly is the role of humans? Well, the majority of the climate change is because of us, all right? We have increased the amount of greenhouse gases we're producing, and we need to do a better job. And there's another chart with data that was collected, and you can see that steep incline in the amount of carbon dioxide produced. So how do we know? How do we know how much carbon dioxide used to be in our atmosphere? Well, it's pretty easy, actually. We have data of what the atmosphere is like many years ago to now. And the reason why we have that data is because we have these things called ice cores, and that's what you can see down in the picture below. Ice cores are just these little tubes of ice that we pull out of glaciers that have been there hundreds of thousands of years. And so we pull them out, and when ice forms, it makes little bubbles. If you've ever made ice cubes in an ice tray in your fridge, you'll notice sometimes you get little bubbles of air in there. So these little bubbles of air trap ancient atmospheres, and we can use a mass spectrometer to analyze what is in those gases. And so we know exactly the percentage of gases that were found in our atmosphere from many years ago, even before humans were around to collect data. So human activities have had many effects on our ecosystems, but they're definitely compounded by some of our other activities like pollution and fragmenting our organisms' habitats, invasive species, overfishing, and messing with our water. All these things, of course, make it much worse, the effects that are occurring here. The good news is we know some ways to do better, and we have some technologies to do better, and we are doing some things, but we need to do much more. All right, we need to change how we live our lives so that we can think about the world as a large system instead of just us personally. All right, so some places where changes in our activities could help is our approaches to agriculture, which have improved, so there's very good news there. Water management practices, which are tied into that agriculture. Energy sources and use. Now this is somewhere we are changing, but very slowly, and we need to change it at a much faster rate than we are. Transportation is getting slightly better with the introduction of hybrid and electric vehicles. Pollution remediation, again, we got to have those regulations in place to control what industry is doing. And biological conservation. Now here's somewhere some people are doing the work and others are not. So climate change is a large and complex, but it's very likely that many people working from many angles can help address climate change and its ecological consequences. The sad part is we need to do this soon, okay? We can't wait. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to make a second part showing you some of the evidence for climate change. All right, folks, here we are again. We are going to be talking about some of the evidences for climate change. So as a scientist, I'm big on data, so we're looking for global mean temperatures and how quickly they are rising over time. So here you can see we have some data into recent times about what is going on and what is the overall trend. So the lines go up and down. We have cooler years and warmer years and seasonal things going on. And so we're in the yellow is the error, because there is some error associated with these measurements, just like anything in science. But we still see an overall trend, and that's what we're looking for, the linear trends over time, that these things are increasing. So the pink one is over 100 years, and the green is over 50 years. And if we're looking at the last 50 years, it's even more steep of a trend. Okay, so the warmest 12 years are the most recent 12 years. And so here's another graph taken by another group of scientists looking at global temperature change from 1855 to 2010. And you can see that even though we had some warm years in here, that overall the last couple decades, we are seeing significantly larger increases. And again, look at the scale. These aren't even whole degrees here, but it is like 1 degree from the coldest to the warmest. And that's what we're seeing is it's not huge amounts of difference, but even these tiny little differences have profound effects on our ecosystems. Other evidence is what's going on with our glaciers. So here's our glacier in 1875, and then in 2004 in the same spot in the same time of year. And you can see the glacier is gone, okay? It is now turned into a lake. The good part about that is the new source of fresh water. The bad part about that is all this stuff is altering the ecosystem. This is going to make it much warmer, all this dark rock under here. And on top of this, a lot of this water lands up in our ocean, which raises sea levels. So here's some more. Here's one in 1914, and here we are back in the same place in 2004, and you can see that glacier is completely melted. All right, here's another glacier that you can see has almost completely melted. So there's no doubt that this is occurring. You can visually see it. All right, so back to our glaciers and frozen ground, looking at data. So this is data of our glaciers and how much basically ice retreat we have occurring in different places. And so cumulative total mass balance. So the mass is decreasing rapidly over time to see those effects. And this is an area of seasonally frozen ground. So you can see we have less and less frozen ground as the years go by. And please keep in mind, it should not be occurring this rapidly. It is natural for the Earth to change, but not in decades, thousands of years normally. Snow cover and Arctic sea ice decreasing. So spring snow cover shows 5% drop in the 1980s. So we're seeing a decrease there. Arctic sea ice is rapidly decreasing. So we're seeing a lot of change there, which is not good. Other evidence of climate change, the ocean heat content has increased. So they can actually measure the heat content of the ocean and what the temperatures are like and change them over time. This particular one is in the Atlantic. All right, then we can use satellite data as well. So we're looking at sea levels from satellites in the last 10 years. And so we can see how the sea level is rising. Now this is in millimeters, which is quite small, okay? But this does add up over time to losing some of our coastline. All right, more recent sea level rise, again, same trend, looking at satellites and human observation. We can also study climate change indirectly by looking at tree rings in trees. So if you look at the trees that are many, many, many years old, you can see what's going on with the weather and how much water there was. So in high rain years, the rings are quite wide, and when there's not a lot of rain, they're quite narrow. So these are called proxy indicators. So they kind of give you an indication about the climate without any direct measurement. So we can go back pretty far with our trees. Some of these trees, like the bristlecone pine, live up to 10,000 years. So they live quite a long time. And so they can look at the tree rings from literally thousands of years ago to see what the weather was like. And again, wide years, high rain, skinny years, low rain. Right, so we also have all this information about temperatures and how they're changing over time. And if you look at the graph in these early years, it's not that bad until you look at the very end and you see this sharp increase up here. Here's some of our ice cores that I said are reasons how we know what gases were present. So you can see there's going to be little bubbles trapped in there that the scientists are pulling out of these old glaciers. Here you can see the little bubbles trapped. All right, so we can look at the isotopes in there and figure out what the temperature was. All right, and here's some more information. This is from the International Panel on Climate Change. And so they've all taken all this information to you about the amount of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfates, and we all see this J-shaped curve at the end, which is after humans have industrialized the world and burned those fossil fuels. Here's some more graphs from the International Committee, and you can see the same trend, this sharp increase in all these gases. So there's no doubt that humans have contributed to this. So how can we respond to climate change? Well, one of the things is by altering what we're using as a source of electricity. Our carbon footprints in the United States are quite large. We're not the worst, but we're close, okay? So most of our electricity right now is by burning fossil fuels. We are making slight gains towards using more renewable energies like wind energy and solar, but we're just not being efficient enough. So there's other ways we can do energy efficient technologies, which we do have, things like LED light bulbs, energy efficient stoves and refrigerators, all of those, which does decrease the amount of energy you need, so you burn less coal to produce that energy. And they reduce the use of electrical devices. Now this we've been really bad about, all of us are, all right, not just guys. So these are some places we really need to look at to make a difference, especially our energy sources. So what could we use? We could use nuclear power, and the public is very nervous about nuclear power, but really the technology has come so far, and it's just that we've had these high-profile meltdowns that happen, and that scares people because you can have really profound effects. But we've learned from those meltdowns on how to do this energy source better. And there is, it's actually a really good, stable energy source and pretty cheap to run. As a matter of fact, France runs its entire country on nuclear power. Solar power is not continuous because the sun does not always shine, but it can supplement some of the other energy sources. Same with wind power. You can't run a country entirely off of wind power because the wind does not always blow. But you can supplement it so you can burn less coal. So you have to have then solar and wind in conjunction with something more reliable, either nuclear power or coal power. Hydroelectric only works in places that has this kind of water features that you can put dams in and collect them. And so we do use some hydroelectric power in the United States, but it's not a major source of energy. Geothermal is another one that you have to actually have the kind of land that can facilitate this, and in the United States we don't have a lot of that. Advances in vehicle technology actually has helped quite a bit. Transportation is the second largest source of greenhouse gases after industry. And in industry I include power sources. All right, alternatives to fuel-only cars include hybrid vehicles that have gotten more popular. Vehicles that use alternative fuels such as compressed natural gas or biofuels. We have some of those. We have the flex fuel vehicles, but they're not used in huge quantities. And then we look at vehicles that might do other things like hydrogen fuel cells, which have not been very popular because they're quite explosive. But we're also looking at electric vehicles, which are gaining in popularity too. We can also just reduce our dependence on cars. Let's start biking and walking more, which is healthier to begin with, and that would reduce our fossil fuel use. In order to do this efficiently, we need to plan our communities better around public transportation or around the ability to people walk and get places. And this is starting to occur, and we will talk about this more in later units. So what strategies can we do? We can alter our agricultural and forestry management so that we can prevent soil erosion, replace those cut down trees so they keep absorbing. Trees are great at absorbing carbon dioxide. If we all just went out and planted some trees instead of just grass, we could really reduce our carbon dioxide pollution. We can deal with the cap and trade. This is a system of emission allowances, some of those loopholes that industries use where they can sell or trade the ability to produce these emissions, and that's not necessarily a good thing. We can start taxing carbon, so we can start taxing companies based on the amount of emissions they produce, which financially encourages them to produce less. The bad side of that is we don't want to do it to a point where it makes it so companies don't want to come in and provide jobs here. We can do carbon offsets, so instead of directly reducing emissions, companies can make payments instead, so they have a choice, so that we can use other mitigating things that we can put that money towards, basically. And then we have this one, carbon sequestering, and this is something that scientists are looking at, ways to trap carbon, and there's been a variety of little startups that have gone, and it's just not very cost effective right now, and so it's not really being used. One of the things we hope to do is have a lot of cooperation among nations, and there have been several times nations have come together to work on our environmental issues because we are one planet, and what is done in one country when you're talking about your atmosphere will affect another country. So there was this thing called the Kyoto Protocol. It was an international agreement to reduce the greenhouse gases below 1990 levels. The United States did not sign this protocol, but many nations did, and they started working towards an agreement to reduce their greenhouse gases. Since then, we also had the Paris Climate Agreement. So this is one that's controversial right now because President Trump pulled us out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and we landed up being the only ones who did not sign this agreement. Originally, Syria and Nicaragua did not sign it, but then later in 2017, they did. So we are the only ones who are not associated with this agreement. And that's very problematic considering we are definitely one of the leading countries. And so what we do or do not do makes a big impact on what's going on in our planet. So hopefully right now, President-elect Biden has said that he's going to join the Paris Climate Agreement. And if he does, then maybe we can do some good. All right, so hopefully through all this very long lecture, you guys have learned a lot about climate change and the evidence for that. If you are still unsure, please do some research. Don't go on YouTube, but find some valid sources. All right, bye guys.